All right, we are recording. This is our very first journal club at the UW Pre-Physician Scientists Club. And today we're going to be introducing Sophia. She is a current MD-PhD student. And although this isn't necessarily a journal club per se, it's more of a get to know someone who's already in the field, learning about their story, their experiences, and possibly a Q&A session to learn more directly from her. So I'll pass it over to Sophia to introduce herself and walk us through.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name's Sophia Renaud. I'm a current M1 first-year med student at the Harvard MIT MD-PhD program. I guess I'll just launch into a little bit of like my backstory, how I got here, what I think is interesting moving forward. So I grew up in Western Massachusetts, which is kind of the rural half of the state, very different than Boston. And I think my kind of path to medicine began in high school, more or less. I was always someone who really liked math and science. But it wasn't until I started volunteering at my local hospital that I realized that medicine was something that I was interested in and something that I could see being fulfilling long term. I don't really have any doctors or scientists in my family, so that was really kind of the first exposure to something like that. But it was a ton of fun, and it kind of got me on the medical track at least. So in deciding where to go to college, I went to Northeastern University, which is here in Boston. And I decided to study biomedical physics because I really couldn't choose. I was like, biochem, physics, all sounds great to me. And so I ended up just kind of sticking with that all the way through. I would say my first year in Boston specifically, I was really focused on understanding more what a career in healthcare could look like and what I might want it to look like. And so I think it was in that first year and a half where I kind of understood that physician scientist was a thing that you could be, and that there were specific training programs for something like that. Although I still wasn't really considering it super seriously, as I was like, yeah, I want to treat patients. I want to be a doctor. This is what I've wanted. This is, kind of the track that I had been set on. And so for that first year, I spent a lot of time talking to a lot of different people in a lot of different roles. So that's where I did a lot of my preliminary shadowing and a lot of different specialties to make sure that I'm really on the track that was right for me. And it was great being in a place like Boston where you could interact with so many different physicians of different specialties and different backgrounds and different balances. Freshman year was also when I joined my first lab, which was a lab at Northeastern. It was a biophysics lab that was really focused on the application of something called photodynamic therapy, which is how can we use light to more effectively treat cancer, and specifically to apply chemotherapy drugs in a more targeted and specific way, as opposed to kind of general systemic chemotherapy. And so that was really my first foray into research. I didn't really know what it meant before joining this lab. It was a really good way to kind of get my foot in the door in a way and start to understand oh, there's this whole network of reading papers and understanding science that is still a question mark, as opposed to what we're taught in lectures and about, the mitochondria and what it does and period, as opposed to all of the question marks that I'm sure many of us are familiar with in science. And so that kind of piqued my interest. I also had some really, my mentors were amazing along the way, the grad students I worked with and my PI. And I guess it's important to note that he was a really young PI, which was great because he had a lot of time and energy to talk to me about science. And the first time I talked to him, he didn't even know me. We sat and talked about, quantum mechanics, which I didn't understand, for 2 hours, and so getting really good mentors in your corner, I just kind of got lucky, but it really helps if you start early. And so, okay, moving on from that, Northeastern has a kind of unique way of approaching classes in which we have this thing called a co-op program, which basically means you alternate between working full-time and taking classes full-time. So my entire freshman year, I was in classes the whole way through. And then summer after my freshman year, I also took classes all the way through to kind of compensate for that time that I would be doing full-time work. Another point there, I studied abroad summer after freshman year. And just as a life note, so fun. Make sure you do some things that are not quote unquote the perfect thing to be doing. I studied Italian art and architecture, and it was such a blast. Oh, looked like a question in the chat. Oh, what's a PI? So a PI is the acronym for principal investigator. They're usually the people that kind of like head a research program or a lab at an academic institution. And so PIs can range in like age and like topic from like all the different sciences. And labs can range from like just the PI and a couple other people to like 40 or 50 people large. And so, yeah. Thanks, Daniel. Okay, starting sophomore year. This was when I was thinking about where to apply for my first co-op, which would be 8 months of full-time work. And so I decided to apply something in research. I knew that I really enjoyed like my previous lab environment and like the type of science we were doing. But I wanted to get into something that was a little bit less focused on like a specific disease treatment, as in like application of chemotherapy, and move into something that's a little bit more like basic science, understanding the underlying biology of a certain system. I also kind of leaned into this idea of I wanted to do something in neuroscience. It was something I had been interested in a while. I feel like a lot of us are kind of inherently interested in the brain, how it functions, why it functions the way it does, because that's how we conceive things as well. And that wasn't something that was going to be covered in my like biophysics degree program at all. So with those two things in mind, I kind of went through this like co-op application process, which is relatively similar to just like applying for a job. And I ended up selecting a position at Harvard Medical School here in the lab of David Ginty. He does the neuroscience underlying our sense of touch, which I'll come back to, and I can talk a lot more about like specific mechanisms and experiments and everything if that's something that people are interested in. But I would say that it was really that experience that I started January of my sophomore year and continued until I graduated. That really was the most transformative, both like internally for myself as a scientist and externally, like changing what career path I wanted to do. I guess I'll just pause and say if there are questions along the way, feel free to interrupt. But yeah, I'll monitor the chat a little bit too. So it was really this experience. And again, another example where like the postdocs are people who already have their PhD and are continuing on in research training past their PhD, usually in a slightly different field or a slightly different lab. And so they are kind of like intermediate mentors between you and the head of the lab. So the postdocs that I worked with were amazing. And so was the PI, like really supportive and really like looked out for me before I knew how to like look out for myself. And we're thinking about like, oh, maybe you should like go to this conference or present here or do something like that, which wasn't really something that I thought a ton about until they brought it up. And now looking back, like those were amazing growth opportunities that I feel really thankful because I didn't really know how to advocate for that myself. And they were just amazing mentors and were really invested in seeing me grow as a scientist. And so I think it was about that time at the end of my first research stint, so 6 to 8 months in, just kind of serendipitously, I was working with 2 postdocs at the time. One of them left to go to a like month-long course and the other one on paternity leave. So they left me and the project. And I would say that it was really that month where both of them were gone, where I was like, dang, like I could do science long-term, like I could be a graduate student. And it was that kind of like getting thrown in the deep end and figuring out that you could swim that really was like, wow, should I consider this more seriously as a like large portion of my career? And so then we're kind of entering into junior year of college. And I would say all of fall junior year, I was really going back and forth. I was talking to a lot of people, and I would totally recommend that as well. I was talking to people with MDs that do research, MD-PhDs that practice, MD-PhDs that don't practice, MD-PhDs at totally different stages of training, MD-PhDs from different places, and really just trying to get a sense of like what a career could look like in any of these different degree programs. Because I was really spanning the whole thing of like, MD, PhD, or do I just want to do the PhD and do research full time? And so I was really undecided for quite a while. And so one thing, I think I was really trying to decide for myself, like, even beyond what's important for the application, I was like, I want to make sure that I'm applying to the thing that I want to do, not the thing that maybe I've been fixated on for like any number of years. And so to kind of get at that question, I had just spent 8 months in lab full time. And so I decided to really spend some time investigating clinical aspects of like a career. And so I took a job at a hospital here in Boston called Tufts Medical Center. And I was working with neurological and neurosurgical patient populations. And the best way for me to describe that job, it has a ton of different names, but I was more or less like a nurse that doesn't prescribe or do anything with medications. And so that was like an extremely patient-facing role that I wanted to take on for myself to really get at the question, do I want to treat patients? Because if you do not want to treat patients, the MD PhD is probably not the optimal degree for you. Just because it is 4 years that you're learning to treat patients. And if you don't want to, why spend the time? Why not just spend it doing more research? But of course, so much nuance goes into that. And, it gets very complicated. But so it was through this position and interacting with doctors and interacting with patients where the pendulum kind of like swung back to the middle, where I was like, yeah, I really, really want to treat patients, which was great. But I think the most important aspect of it is, so my background is the sensory neuroscience of touch. And so sometimes I would see patients in clinic that would have like specific spinal cord compressions or like specific hand tremors. And I would start to think about like, okay, what are the sensory motor circuits that might underlie disease pathology or something like that? And so it was those like small moments of connections that I was able to make between my research and like the patients I was seeing that really got me excited about like occupying that space long term. And so by kind of December of my junior year, I decided that like MD PhD was it. I was going to go all in. I was going to apply. And it was really comforting. Like once I made the decision, I still feel totally confident in it. And like, I really knew it was the right thing for me, but I'm very glad I went through like a multiple month-long period of going back and forth and like really interrogating myself about like what I wanted to do. So then I kind of got into like the application swing of things. This was in January of 2020. So we all kind of know COVID hit, kind of threw everything out of whack. I was one of the ones whose MCAT dates got canceled, moved around. I'm not going to bother anyone with any of that. It seems like we're past the worst of it. But I ended up submitting my application in the spring of my junior year, where I was working at the hospital and working in lab when we were like allowed to go back in. And so then I finished up my senior year, went through the application process. And the thing about my program here is I graduated from college in May. I had a month off and then I started. So it's been a real whirlwind since then. And it's been so much fun, but each day feels like 10, but then I look back and I'm like, wow, it's been 6 months. Not quite, but almost. Yeah, so I guess now here I am fully immersed in medical school. The way that the Harvard MIT program does it is you do one rotation before you start medical school, summer before you start your M1 year. So I did one rotation in a lab here, studying kind of the neural coding of prediction and comparison between external sensory stimuli and internal like predictive models. Which was super interesting and relatively different than what I did in undergrad. But sitting here right now, that's relatively different from my day-to-day. So right now I am fully in medical school. I'm in class every day, studying, going through the whole thing, patients, learning like all of anatomy, physiology, really like getting that foundational knowledge, which has been a lot of fun, but definitely a steep learning curve. And so I guess for people in the audience that maybe aren't as super familiar with like the MD PhD timeline, the way it's done here is that you do your first 2 years of medical school and then you break and you leave and you go do your PhD, which I will be joining the neuroscience PhD program most likely. You break, you go do your PhD. For most people that takes 4 years, for some it takes 3, for some it takes 5. There's a little bit of wiggle room in there. And then once you conclude your PhD, you head back to the clinic to conclude your last 2 years of medical school. And then after that, whether it be 7, 8, 9 years are the most common, that's when you graduate with both degrees and then traditionally move on to a residency. So that's kind of where I am right now, deep in medical school. It is a little bit strange to leave research somewhat behind. I'm not in lab right now. I haven't done an experiment in months, which definitely feels strange. But as time goes on, you start to integrate research a little bit more as you build that like really strong foundation of knowledge. All right, so that was a lot of information, but that was kind of my life up to this date. I guess I'll pause if there are any sort of like questions or anything. You can just shout them out.
Where did you go for your undergrad?
Yeah, I went to Northeastern University, which is a private university in Boston.
And then you went to Harvard and MIT for your grad, right?
I'm currently at HMS, Harvard Medical School, which is a joint program with MIT.
Yep.
How do you think virtual interviews went and compared to like more in-person stuff? I'm currently struggling with virtual interviews for the same application process.
Yeah, I think virtual interviews were pretty tough. I'm someone who like really enjoys meeting people in person and connecting on like that sort of level. So I was pretty disappointed that I wasn't able to go through the process kind of in person as it has been previously. I think that as you move through the process, it does get a little bit better, especially when you get to the end where you're like making a decision. Once you get to that point, I found that like every student I wanted to talk to was more than happy to talk with me. And everyone really understands how hard it is to make a decision, oftentimes between places that you've never been before, which was like the case for me. I was like, I have no idea what it means to like live in a place like this. I ultimately ended up staying in a place that I knew, but it was just the best fit for me. So I would say really don't be afraid to reach out to people. Like I know everyone always puts like their emails in the chat I just came from an interview thing and everyone puts their emails in the chat, but do not be afraid to like copy and paste those and really like reach out to the people you want to talk to. Everyone is just like, they want to help you find the program where you will like be the happiest, healthiest, best version of yourself.
I'd like to open the floor for any other questions. I have a few prepared also that I think we could use to maybe motivate another conversation as we go deeper in, but I would like to open the floor for anyone. All right, well, I will just ask my questions and I think we can go deeper in. I know you mentioned, Sophia, about how you were having a little bit of trouble deciding between an MD, an MD PhD, and a PhD. Many of us now are in that state where we're trying to figure out which we like most. And due to COVID, a lot of us don't have access to go into clinic to really get a sense for the in-person kind of feel. So I was kind of wondering what your thought process was and what are some things we should keep in mind as we go through the same, I guess, filtering out of what we want to do.
Yeah. So I think at the kind of logistical level, the reason I was able to like take this position clinically was because I had my EMT certification. So it was like a completely like, it was a job. And so I think that if that's something you're really considering, hospitals are still hiring people with the like proper qualifications. So if that's something you're really invested in, you can totally spend the time, get the certification. I really enjoyed the entire process. And like, it's not something that I found to be super common in like my MD PhD classmates, but the people that did really enjoyed it. So I would say just like off the bat, that is an option, although it is pretty time intensive to like get the certification and also spend the time working. Like I have gotten questions like, oh, why didn't you spend all that time in lab? But my answer to that is like, well, I wanted to know if I wanted to practice medicine. And so I think stepping back a little bit, like how do you decide which track and like how to navigate that for yourself? I thought a lot about where I wanted to be in like really long term. Like, how did I want my entire career to span out? Which is kind of interesting to think about, because I'm sitting here and I'm not going to tell you like I'm absolutely doing X or Y residency, or even that like I'm going to do my thesis on like X or Y subject. But I think it really came down to the question of, one, do I want to see patients? Because for me, there was no point in getting an MD degree if I did not want to see patients, at least in some capacity. And so I guess a little bit more on that. So the NIH training grant that funds a lot of these programs is called the MSTP, Medical Science Training Program grant. And so they put forth this idea that a physician scientist is someone who spends 80% of their time in lab doing more basic science research and 20% of their time in clinic. And so I thought that that was a model that I could really see myself fitting in well with. I really liked that balance of research while also spending time with patients, and enough time to form like longitudinal relationships with, yes, a smaller subset of patients from my clinical only colleagues, but still make a difference clinically, as well as continuing like basic science research. And so I also could see a world in which I was a PI, like principal investigator. And so I think for me, what it really came down to is like, I could not imagine dropping either one of those things. I definitely wanted to practice medicine, and I definitely wanted to like continue doing this basic science research. And at the most like ideal point, I would want to do like occupy a place where I could do both. And in the sense that like my research was directly impacting like the small subset of patients of like diseases and disorders that I was focused on as a clinician. And so really when I came around to that idea where I was like, yeah, this is what I want, this training pathway was like the best way to get there, and like the most comprehensive training I could get to like get to the place where I wanted to end up. And so I think that what really helped me through that was, as I mentioned, just talking to anyone who will talk to you. Like I talked to so many different people in and out of the different departments. And I found that people are really, really open to helping you navigate your own path, with the caveat that most people do think what they did was the best thing to be done, which, I'd say the same thing about my own life. And so I think that idea of like gathering information from so many different sources, which can be talks like this, it can be people you cold email, it can be people in your lab, or people like really from anywhere, just getting like multiple different perspectives, which I still think is possible in like the time of COVID. People are probably even more happy to jump on a Zoom call than to like have you come into their office. And then really asking them like, okay, what does your day-to-day look like? How did you decide which program to go to? How has your training impacted your like life from then? And like, what does your life look like now? Like, how much time do you spend with your friends and family and all that sort of thing? All of which are really important considerations. But everyone you talk to will have, their own balance of everything: research, clinic, life outside. And so I think getting that like broad diversity of people in broadly science, medicine, technology was really helpful in like understanding what's even out there in the first place.
Thanks, Sophia. So kind of as a takeaway, it's sort of gathering a lot of diverse experiences, or hearing a lot of other people's perspectives and hearing their experiences to kind of capture what we want to do in the future. And as soon as we sort of better understand ourselves and what we're looking for, that can really prime us to make that right decision, and to just follow our gut when it gets to the point where we can pick.
Yeah, well said.
Gotcha. Awesome. As a follow-up question, I know we brought up this idea of the 80-20 split between being a scientist and being a clinician. I was wondering kind of how that 20% of being a clinician fits in with the research. I've heard a lot about translational work or, bench to bedside, but often it's a little difficult to see what that looks like, or maybe an example that we can use to picture it in our heads.
Yeah. So I think it looks a lot of different ways for a lot of different people. And that balance definitely shifts depending on what your like clinical interest is. So I think the best example I can think of is the director of my program right now. His name's Lauren Walensky. He is a pediatric oncologist that also has a basic science laboratory at Children's. So he studies like the Bax protein, which is a pro-apoptotic protein that is implicated in a lot of possible like chemotherapies and like cancer research. And so he studies that while also seeing patients with cancer. And so there is a lot of, yes, he is the husband of the CDC director. Rochelle's great. He kind of occupies that space of someone who sees patients and also does research that will impact those patients. And so I think that that's like a really nice example of how things can work out in the way that like your clinic and your science really meld well together. I think that there are a lot of people that are melding things in different ways. And that's one thing I find super exciting about this is, you'll find people that started in one place and ended up in another, or did their graduate work in neuroscience, but now are doing something completely different. And so I think that the idea that the PhD is scientific training first and foremost, and not necessarily what you are going to research long-term. And so I think that the balance, the 80-20 balance is an amazing like framework to think about it. But I think that there are many ways that you can walk through life as a physician scientist. One of them being this really sort of like translational bench to bedside way, but other of them being like, I know MD PhDs that are fully computational, and they still see patients and it's still great. And so I think one thing that has really changed for me, thinking back to when I first heard about the MD PhD, was really broadening my horizon on like what a physician scientist can look like. And both in the sense of like the type of research you can pursue and also the type of patients and like clinical roles that you can fulfill.
I could
Sweet.
kind of give another example of like how people split their time. My old PI was a physician scientist, and she split her time by like dedicating 1 week out of a month to clinical service. It was called, I guess, on service. That was what they called it. So 1 week, she was only seeing patients, and then the next 3 weeks she was doing research in the lab, usually based on the stuff that she saw in the clinic. And this was like directly related to what she was doing, because in the clinic she would often dissect tumors out of patients, bring them back into the lab, and then I got to prepare like a cell line based on a human sample. So that's like a very direct physician scientist job of like, it's not bench to bedside, it's more like bedside to bench, but hopefully you could kind of convert it back into like the lives of patients if you find something.
Thanks, Daniel. And thanks, Sophia, for walking us through. I think Luna had a question. I think your hand was raised. I wanted to come back.
Okay, so I'm sorry if this is a stupid undergrad question, but do you find the physics part of your undergrad degree useless for medicine? Because didn't you say you did biochem and physics?
Yeah, my technical major was biomedical physics, which was basically a physics major with some more biological physics and biomedical physics components. I would say that my undergraduate training prepared me really well for medical school, not in the sense of content, as in like, I didn't really know too much about what the kidney did before I studied for the MCAT and before I came here, but just in the sense of like, how do we approach problems? I feel like my physics background really helped in allowing me to feel comfortable in situations where I didn't know everything. Because a lot of my physics exams were like, all right, here's a massive extension of something that we haven't taught you per se, but you have some of the tools where you can figure it out most of the way. And so I think that skill set of like learning to think critically and learning to take the information you have, pair it with the tools and skill set that you have to come up with like the best possible answer was really helpful in kind of transitioning over to medicine. So kind of that like mental framework translated over, but like the sort of content didn't as much.
Got it.
Cool. I had one more question, Sophia, and then we can open it up. I know we're kind of getting close to the end of the time that we had blocked. I wanted to ask about the PhDs and selecting PhDs or knowing what area that you want to do research in. As an undergrad, there aren't too many ways to experience a whole bunch of different fields, especially given how broad the types of biomedical research there are. So I wanted to ask, is it possible to switch research focuses after getting into an MD PhD program, or how confident do we need to be that this is the area of research that we want to do as an applicant?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that on applying, you should have an idea of the type of research you think could be a really interesting place to do your PhD, or like a interesting place for you to do your PhD. I know that a lot of people come into these programs thinking they're going to join one graduate program and end up joining another one. It's really common. So the idea that you have to like in advance select out the type of PhD you are going to do, at least in my program, is not common. And so I think that getting enough research training so that you understand what it means to be a scientist and ask questions about biology or like pathology or anything like that is really important. And being able to talk about that in like a really meaningful and deep way is important for like even understanding for yourself why you're coming to a program like this. But in terms of specific subject matter, I would say that it's probably not of great consequence.
Wonderful. Thank you. Oh, we got more questions. Feel free to unmute.
So I know you've talked a lot about like the research component and then like practicing medicine, but I was wondering about like how did like teaching and then academia fall into the MD PhD versus MD versus PhD?
Yeah, so I think that's another thing where you can really tailor your career to what you want to like accomplish with it. A lot of our classes, I think the majority of my medical school classes are taught by MD PhD individuals, and they're phenomenal teachers, and they do spend a lot of time really working on their courses and everything like that. But that is a decision that they made for themselves, that they wanted to get involved in like teaching medical students and everything like that. So I think really once you get to a place where you kind of finish this long training road of ballpark 8 years for your MD PhD and then your residency and then a fellowship or postdoc or something like that. Once you get there, you probably have a much better idea, or I'm hoping I'll have a much better idea of how I want to split my time, because some people are much more heavily in clinic and teaching, and some people are much more into mentorship in the terms of like basic science. So I really think once you build the foundation of skills that come from this degree program and further training, you really have the ability to select where you want to spend your time for the most part.
Thank you.
All right. Are there any other questions? It's like there aren't, but if you're comfortable with sharing your email or contact Sophia, that'd be great. And then we can share that with our members in case anyone wants to reach out with any further questions.
Yeah, let me just put it in the chat.
All right. Well, thank you so much again for joining us. It's probably decently late on the East Coast right now, but we really appreciate it. And it was very insightful. I'm sure it was for all of us. And we thank you for joining us today. We hope
Yeah,
to
of
stay in
course.
touch.
Yeah, email if you have any questions. All right, have a good night,
All right.
guys.
See you
Thank you
guys.
so much.